When you wake up with pressure on your chest, when the weight of unanswered prayers, unpaid bills, broken relationships, delayed promises, and silent seasons presses against your soul, something inside you whispers, I don't know how much longer I can fight. You've been pushing, striving, explaining yourself, defending your name, carrying responsibilities that feel heavier than your strength. You've been trying to fix what you cannot control, trying to hold together what feels like it's falling apart. And yet, deep within your spirit, there is a truth that refuses to die. You were never designed to carry this battle alone. You were never meant to be the hero of your own salvation. The battle you are facing right now is not yours. It's God's. There comes a moment in every believer's life when human effort reaches its limit, when your wisdom runs dry, your strategies fail, your energy collapses, and your confidence fades. That moment feels like defeat. But in the kingdom of God, it is often the doorway to divine intervention. God waits for the end of self-reliance so that his power can take center stage. He waits for you to stop wrestling so he can start working. Not because he is distant, but because he honors the posture of surrender. When you finally lay down your weapons of anxiety, fear, control, and pride, heaven stands ready to fight on your behalf. You were never designed to carry life's battles on your own. From the very beginning, humanity was created to live in relationship with God, to walk in dependence, trust, and obedience. Yet so often, when pressure rises, our instinct is to take control, to solve everything with our own strength, logic, and effort. We push harder, worry deeper, and exhaust ourselves emotionally and spiritually, believing that if we just try enough, something will change. But the truth remains, human strength has limits. Energy runs out, patience fades, wisdom fails, and courage weakens. That is not a flaw in your design. It is proof that learning to depend on God is essential for a fulfilled and victorious life. When you attempt to fight every battle alone, you begin to carry burdens that were never assigned to you. Fear becomes your companion. Anxiety becomes your daily routine. And stress begins to shape your decisions. You replay conversations, imagine worst-case scenarios, and anticipate outcomes that may never happen. The mind becomes crowded with noise, doubts, and pressure. Your heart grows tired, your joy fades, and your faith begins to feel distant, not because God has left you, but because you have unconsciously placed yourself in a position God never intended you to occupy, the position of ultimate control. God never called you to be the source of your own peace, provision, protection, or direction. He called you to trust him. He called you to lean on his understanding instead of your own. The moment you acknowledge that you cannot handle everything by yourself is not a sign of weakness. It is the doorway to divine strength. When you reach the end of yourself, you finally make room for God to step in fully. Surrender creates space for grace. Humility unlocks heaven's help. Dependence invites divine intervention. Every believer eventually encounters situations that expose the limits of human ability. There are problems that cannot be solved by intelligence, money, connections, or effort alone. There are seasons where no matter how hard you try, progress seems slow or non-existent. These moments are not punishment, they are invitations. God is gently teaching you to stop striving and start trusting. He is shifting your focus from what you can do to what he can do. He's reminding you that your life was never meant to be powered solely by your strength, but by his presence. When you allow God to fight for you, something remarkable happens inside your heart. Peace replaces panic. Clarity replaces confusion. Confidence replaces insecurity. You stop feeling like everything depends on your performance and you start resting in God's faithfulness. You realize that you don't have to manipulate outcomes, control people, or force open doors. What is meant for you will come in God's timing. What is not meant for you cannot be sustained by human effort anyway. Trust releases the pressure to perform and replaces it with the freedom to obey. Trying to fight alone often creates emotional exhaustion because you are attempting to carry tomorrow's worries with today's strength. You are borrowing trouble from the future and dragging it into the present. God never asked you to solve your entire life in one day. He only asked you to walk faithfully in the step right in front of you. When you give God your today, he faithfully handles your tomorrow. Faith is not about knowing every answer. It is about trusting the one who holds every answer. There is also a deep spiritual dimension to this truth. Many battles are not merely circumstantial, they are spiritual. Discouragement, fear, confusion, temptation, and delay often have spiritual roots that cannot be overcome by natural effort alone. When you try to fight spiritual battles with human strength, you become frustrated and vulnerable. But when you lean on God, you engage divine power, wisdom, and protection. You realize that prayer is not your last option. It is your first defense. Worship is not an emotional response. It is a spiritual weapon. Trust is not passive. It is powerful alignment with God's authority. Letting God fight for you does not mean you become careless or passive in life. It means your actions flow from faith instead of fear. You still work, plan, prepare, and pursue excellence, but your confidence is no longer rooted in your own ability. It is rooted in God's faithfulness. You are no longer driven by panic or power, assured but guided by peace and obedience. Your identity is not attached to success or failure, but anchored in God's love and purpose for your life. One of the greatest freedoms you will ever experience is the realization that you are not responsible for being perfect. God never expected flawless performance from you. He desires a surrendered heart, a willing spirit, and a trusting posture. When you release the burden of perfection, you allow God to work through your imperfections. His strength shines brightest in your weakness. His wisdom becomes evident when your understanding falls short. His grace carries you when your energy fades. As you learn to stop fighting alone, you begin to recognize God's faithfulness in ways you may have overlooked before. You notice the quiet protection, the unexpected provision, the timely encouragement, the doors that open at just the right moment. Your perspective shifts from stress to gratitude, from fear to expectancy, from control to confidence. You become more aware that God has been walking with you all along, even in the seasons when you felt uncertain or overwhelmed. Life will still bring challenges, uncertainties, and moments of pressure. Faith does not eliminate battles. It changes how you face them. Instead of carrying the weight alone, you now walk with divine strength beside you. Instead of feeling isolated, you walk with assurance. Instead of being driven by fear, you move forward with trust. Each battle becomes an opportunity to deepen your dependence on God and strengthen your relationship with Him. When you finally accept that you were never meant to fight alone, you begin to live lighter, freer, and stronger. Your soul breathes again. Your faith stabilizes. Your hope renews. You stop striving for control and start resting in trust. You understand that the same God who created you, called you, and redeemed you is fully capable of sustaining you, guiding you, and defending you. The battle was never meant to rest on your shoulders. It belongs in God's hands where it's always been safest. There's a powerful shift that happens in a person's life when they stop trying to control everything and begin to truly surrender. Many people believe surrender means weakness, loss, or giving up. But in God's kingdom, surrender is the doorway to strength, clarity, and victory. When you release control, you are not abandoning responsibility. You are transferring trust from your limited ability to God's unlimited power. Surrender activates God's intervention because it aligns your heart with His authority and opens space for Him to move freely in your life. Control often comes from fear. We try to manage outcomes because we are afraid of disappointment, rejection, failure, or loss. We hold tightly to people, plans, timelines, and expectations because uncertainty feels unsafe. The mind constantly tries to predict what could go wrong, creating anxiety and pressure that drain emotional and spiritual energy. Over time, this need for control becomes exhausting. It creates stress in relationships, tension in decision-making, and frustration when things don't go as planned. Yet God never intended for you to live in constant tension. He designed your heart for trust, not for burden. Surrender begins when you recognize that your efforts cannot secure the future, protect you from every risk, or guarantee success. No amount of planning can prevent every storm. No amount of effort can control other people's choices. No amount of intelligence can eliminate uncertainty. When you acknowledge these limits, you step into a sacred moment of humility. Instead of resisting reality, you accept your dependence on God. This acceptance does not weaken you, it strengthens you because it connects you to the source of true wisdom, peace, and direction. When you surrender fear, God releases peace. When you surrender worry, God releases clarity. When you surrender pressure, God releases strength. This divine exchange transforms your inner world even before your external circumstances change. You may still face challenges, but your heart is no longer dominated by panic or despair. You begin to trust that God is actively working behind the scenes, arranging details, opening doors, and protecting you from what you cannot see. Surrender does not always change the situation immediately, but it always changes the way you experience the situation. Many people delay surrender because they think they must undo or stand everything before trusting God. They want answers before obedience, clarity before commitment, certainty before faith. But faith does not grow through control. It grows through trust. God often invites you to step forward without having the full picture. He asks you to release the need to know every outcome and instead rest in his character. Trusting God's heart when you cannot trace his hand is one of the deepest expressions of faith. Surrender also requires releasing pride. Pride convinces us that we should be able to handle everything on our own, that asking for help is weakness, and that dependence makes us vulnerable. But humility unlocks divine assistance. When you acknowledge your need for God, you create room for his power to operate in your life. God does not resist brokenness. He responds to it with grace. He does not reject weakness. He fills it with strength. The moment you stop pretending to have it all together is often the moment God begins to move most powerfully. There is a peace that comes when you stop carrying responsibility that belongs to God. You realize that you are not responsible for changing people's hearts, fixing every problem, or forcing every door open. Your role is obedience, not outcome. Your responsibility is faithfulness, not control. When you embrace this truth, the weight begins to lift. You no longer feel pressured to make everything work. You trust God to handle what only he can handle. Surrender is not passive resignation. It is active trust. It means choosing to pray instead of panic, to worship instead of worry, to obey instead of overanalyze. It means making wise decisions while leaving the final results in God's hands. It means showing up faithfully even when you cannot see immediate progress. This kind of surrender strengthens your spiritual endurance and deepens your relationship with God. You begin to recognize his voice more clearly and sense his guidance more confidently. Often God allows you to reach a point of exhaustion so you can finally learn the power of surrender. When your strength runs out, his strength takes over. When your plans collapse, his purpose emerges. When your control fails, his sovereignty becomes evident. These moments are not meant to shame you, but to teach you. They remind you that God is not asking you to be the savior of your own life. He is inviting you to trust the Savior who already paid the price for your freedom and future. As you practice surrender daily, your perspective begins to change. You become less reactive and more grounded. You stop being driven by fear and start being guided by peace. You become more patient with people, more compassionate with yourself, and more confident in God's timing. You no longer rush ahead of God or lag behind in hesitation. You learn to walk in step with his guidance. There will still be moments when your desire to control resurfaces. Old habits don't disappear overnight. But each time you consciously choose surrender, you strengthen your faith muscles. You train your heart to trust instead of fear. You remind yourself that God has proven his faithfulness in the past and will continue to be faithful in the future. Over time, surrender becomes less of a struggle and more of a lifestyle. True freedom is found not in controlling everything, but in trusting the one who controls all things. When you release your grip, God takes over the fight. When you step back, heaven steps forward. When you surrender fully, divine intervention becomes active in ways you could never orchestrate on your own. Your life begins to move with greater peace, purpose, and alignment because you are no longer carrying a burden you were never meant to bear. Many of the struggles people face every day feel personal on the surface, but their roots often go much deeper than circumstances or human behavior. A sudden wave of discouragement, persistent fear, confusion about direction, repeated patterns of failure, or unexplained resistance in progress are not always merely emotional or situational issues. They frequently reflect spiritual battles taking place beneath what the natural eye can see. When people try to fight these battles using only human tools such as logic, willpower, emotions, or external control, they often find themselves frustrated, drained, and defeated. Spiritual challenges require spiritual solutions, and lasting victory comes when you learn to engage God's power rather than relying on your own strength. Human tools are limited because they operate within visible boundaries. You can reason your way through a problem, but reasoning cannot heal a wounded soul. You can motivate yourself with discipline, but discipline alone cannot break spiritual heaviness. You can change environments, routines, and habits, but those changes do not always address the root of internal struggles. Many people have tried self-help strategies, productivity systems, positive thinking, and external fixes, yet still feel empty, restless, or stuck. This does not mean those tools are useless. It means they are insufficient when facing battles that originate in the spiritual realm. Spiritual battles often target the mind first. Thoughts of fear, inadequacy, hopelessness, temptation, and condemnation can quietly shape your identity and decisions if left unchecked. These thoughts may feel natural, but they are often subtle attacks designed to weaken your faith and disconnect you from God's truth. When you respond only with emotional reactions or intellectual arguments, the battle continues beneath the surface. But when you respond with faith, prayer, truth, and surrender, the atmosphere begins to change. God's presence brings clarity where confusion once ruled, peace where anxiety dominated, and strength where weakness prevailed. Trying to win spiritual battles with human effort often leads to burnout. You work harder, push yourself further, and demand more from your mind and body, yet the breakthrough, never fully comes. This cycle creates disappointment and can even weaken your faith if you begin to believe that God is distant or uninterested. In reality, God is inviting you to shift your approach. He is calling you to stop fighting in your own strength and start partnering with his power. Victory is not achieved by force. It is received through alignment with God. Prayer becomes essential in spiritual warfare because it connects you directly to God's authority. Prayer is not simply asking for help. It is positioning your heart in dependence and humility. When you pray, you are acknowledging that you cannot solve everything on your own and that you trust God to intervene. Prayer opens spiritual doors, invites divine wisdom, and releases peace into your inner world. It realigns your perspective with heaven rather than allowing circumstances to dominate your thoughts. Worship is another powerful spiritual weapon. When you worship, you shift your focus away from the size of the problem and toward the greatness of God. Worship lifts your spirit above fear and anxiety and reminds your soul of God's faithfulness and power. Even when emotions resist, choosing to worship strengthens your faith and breaks the grip of discouragement. Worship does not ignore reality. It places reality under God's authority. Faith is the foundation that sustains spiritual victory. Faith is not blind optimism. It is confident trust in God's character and promises. It allows you to stand firm and when circumstances have not yet changed. Faith trains your heart to believe that God is working even when evidence is not visible. This confidence stabilizes your emotions and protects your mind from despair and doubt. Obedience also plays a critical role in spiritual battles. Sometimes the greatest breakthroughs come not from dramatic actions, but from consistent obedience in small things. Choosing integrity when compromise feels easier. Choosing forgiveness when bitterness feels justified. Choosing patience when frustration rises. And choosing trust when fear speaks loudly all shape your spiritual atmosphere. Obedience keeps your heart aligned with God and positions you under his protection and guidance. When you rely on God's power instead of human strength, your battles begin to shift in unexpected ways. You may notice increased peace before you see external change. You may experience clarity in decisions where confusion once dominated. You may develop emotional stability even when circumstances remain challenging. These inner victories are evidence that God is working deeply within you, strengthening your faith and refining your character. Spiritual battles are not meant to terrify you. They are meant to teach you dependence on God. Each challenge becomes an opportunity to deepen your relationship with him. Instead of asking only how to escape the struggle, you begin to ask what God is teaching you through it. Your trust matures, your prayer life strengthens, and your sensitivity to God's guidance increases. Over time, you become more spiritually resilient and less shaken by external pressure. It is important to recognize that relying on God does not eliminate responsibility. You still take wise action, seek counsel, and apply discipline. But your confidence no longer rests in your own ability to control outcomes. It rests in God's wisdom and faithfulness. You learn to act from peace rather than panic, from trust rather than fear. When you stop fighting spiritual battles with human tools, you step into a higher level of spiritual awareness and authority. You realize that you are not powerless, but your power flows from connection with God, not self-effort. Your strength is renewed daily as you remain rooted in prayer, worship, faith, and obedience. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by unseen pressures, you stand firm in confidence that God is actively working on your behalf. This shift transforms how you face every challenge in life. You no longer approach difficulties with anxiety or desperation. You approach them with faith, humility, and expectation. You recognize that God's power is greater than any obstacle and that victory does not depend on your strength, but on your surrender. As you continue to walk in alignment with God, spiritual battles lose their grip, and your life begins to reflect greater peace, clarity, and spiritual stability. There are seasons in life when it feels like nothing is happening. You pray, you believe, you stay faithful, yet outwardly everything seems unchanged. The door remains closed, the answer feels delayed, the breakthrough appears distant, and silence stretches longer than expected. In these moments, the heart is tempted to assume that God is inactive, uninterested, or distant. But the truth is that God often does his deepest work quietly, beneath the surface, long before visible change appears. Just as roots grow underground before fruit becomes visible, God prepares, aligns, and strengthens what cannot yet be seen before releasing what will eventually be seen. Silence does not mean absence. Delay does not mean denial. Waiting does not mean wasted time. God's timing operates with wisdom beyond human understanding. While you are watching the clock, God is shaping character. While you are longing for outcomes, God is building endurance. While you are waiting for doors to open, God is preparing you to walk through them with maturity, humility, and strength. What feels slow to you may be precise in heaven. God never arrives late, and he never acts randomly. Many people misinterpret delay as punishment or rejection. They begin questioning their worth, their calling, or their faith. Doubt creeps in and discouragement begins to cloud hope. But delay is often protection. God sees what you cannot see. He knows what would happen if certain doors opened too early or if certain blessings arrived before your heart was ready to carry them. Sometimes the waiting season saves you from unnecessary pain, premature responsibility, or relationships that could hinder your growth. What you perceive as a setback may actually be divine alignment. God's silent work is often internal before it becomes external. He strengthens your patience so you can sustain future success. He deepens your humility so pride does not destroy what he gives you. He matures your faith so you trust him even when circumstances are uncertain. He refines your motives so your purpose remains pure. These interchanges rarely feel exciting, but they are essential for lasting fruit. A breakthrough that comes without preparation often creates instability, but a breakthrough built on spiritual maturity produces long-term impact. In quiet seasons, your trust is tested. It is easy to believe God when miracles happen quickly and answers arrive clearly. But when progress feels slow and outcomes remain unclear, faith becomes more refined. You learn to trust God not for what he does, but for who he is. You learn to walk with him even when you do not understand the path. This kind of faith strengthens your spiritual foundation and builds a deeper relationship with God that cannot be shaken by external circumstances. There is also a hidden spiritual dimension to waiting. God is often arranging people, opportunities, timing, and circumstances in ways that cannot be rushed. He is aligning events across different lives and situations so that when the moment arrives, everything fits together perfectly. Why, what seems delayed on your timeline may actually be synchronized perfectly on God's timeline. If even one detail were rushed or overlooked, the outcome might not bring the fullness of blessing God intends. The temptation during silent seasons is to take matters into your own hands. You may feel pressure to force solutions, compromise values, or settle for less than what God promised. But shortcuts often lead to unnecessary pain and regret. Waiting requires discipline, patience, and trust. It teaches you to rely on God rather than impulsive decisions. The waiting season protects your future by preventing premature choices that could hinder long-term growth and stability. God also uses silent seasons to sharpen your spiritual sensitivity. When external distractions slow down, you become more aware of your inner life. You learn to listen more carefully, pray more sincerely, and reflect more deeply. These seasons invite you to strengthen your connection with God rather than relying solely on external validation or activity. Silence creates space for intimacy, clarity, and spiritual renewal. Sometimes growth happens so gradually that you don't recognize it while it's happening. Like a seed growing underground, progress is invisible until suddenly something breaks through the surface. One day you realize that your perspective has shifted, your reactions have matured, your peace has stabilized, and your confidence in God has deepened. These changes are evidence that God is and working quietly all along. Waiting seasons also teach gratitude. When you finally see the fruit of God's work, you appreciate it more deeply because you understand the process it took to get there. You no longer take blessings for granted. You recognize the value of patience, perseverance, and trust. The testimony becomes richer because the journey was meaningful. It is important to remember that God is never wasting your time. Every season carries purpose, even when you cannot yet see the result. The silence is not empty, it is active with divine preparation. God is building foundations that will support future blessings. He is strengthening roots that will sustain future fruit. He is refining your heart so you can steward what he is preparing to release. When breakthrough finally arrives, it often feels sudden to the human eye, but it was carefully cultivated over time by God. What appears overnight was actually years in the making. The discipline you developed, the faith you strengthened, the patience you practiced, and the trust you built all contribute to the stability of the victory.
Learning to trust God in silent seasons changes how you approach future challenges. You become less anxious when progress seems slow because you understand that God is still working.
You become more patient with the process and more confident in his timing. Instead of rushing ahead in fear, you learn to walk steadily in faith. When you embrace the truth that God works in silence, or he moves in power, your waiting seasons become seasons of hope instead of frustration. You begin to expect that God is preparing something meaningful rather than assuming nothing is happening. Your faith becomes anchored not in visible progress, but in the character of a faithful God who always completes what he begins. There are moments in life when everything you once depended on seems to fall away. The plans you carefully built no longer work. The people you expected to support you cannot carry you. The resources you trusted begin to run dry. The confidence you once had in your own ability starts to weaken. These moments feel uncomfortable, even frightening, because they remove the sense of control and security you thought you had. Yet these seasons often become the birthplace of the strongest faith you will ever develop. When God becomes your only option, your trust deepens in ways that comfort and convenience can never produce. Faith grows most powerfully when there is nothing left to lean on except God. When every backup plan disappears, your heart is forced to confront what it truly believes. You can no longer depend on human strength, connections, money, or logic to carry you forward. You either grow bitter and fearful, or you grow dependent and trusting. In this space of vulnerability, faith becomes more than a belief system. It becomes a lifeline. You learn to pray not out of habit, but out of hunger. You seek God not because it is routine, but because you genuinely need his guidance and strength. These seasons often feel lonely because no one else can fully understand the internal struggle taking place. On the outside, you may still function normally, but on the inside, you wrestle with uncertainty, fear, and unanswered questions. Yet it is in this quiet wrestling that your spiritual roots grow deeper. You begin to realize that God is not merely a helper in your life. He is your foundation. Your relationship with him becomes more personal, more honest, and more dependent. You stop pretending to have everything under control and start inviting God into every detail of your life. When God is your only option, your prayers change. They become less formal and more sincere. You speak openly about your fears, doubts, hopes, and weaknesses. You stop trying to impress God and simply come as you are. This kind of prayer builds intimacy and trust. It strengthens your awareness that God is near, listening, and actively involved in your life. Your faith becomes relational rather than transactional. In these seasons, you also learn patience. When answers do not come quickly, you are forced to wait. Waiting teaches endurance, humility, and persistence. It refines your motives and strengthens your spiritual discipline. You learn that faith is not only about receiving blessings, but about trusting God even when outcomes remain uncertain. This deepens your spiritual maturity and builds resilience that carries you through future challenges. Dependence on God reshapes your priorities. What once seemed urgent may no longer feel important. You begin to value peace over pressure, obedience over approval, faithfulness over recognition. Your decisions become more grounded in wisdom rather than impulse. You learn to listen more carefully to God's guidance and less to external noise or comparison. This clarity brings stability and confidence even when circumstances remain uncertain. When God becomes your only option, fear begins to lose its grip. Fear thrives on control and predictability, but faith thrives on trust. As you repeatedly choose to trust God in moments of uncertainty, your confidence grows. You begin to recognize that God has carried you through previous storms, and this strengthens your expectation that he will remain faithful in the future. Each small victory builds spiritual momentum and deepens your assurance that you are not walking alone. This kind of faith also reshapes how you view failure and setbacks. Instead of seeing obstacles as proof of defeat, you begin to see them as opportunities for growth and redirection. You trust that God is using every experience to shape your character and refine your purpose. Even when you do not understand the reason behind a delay or disappointment, you learn to trust that God's wisdom surpasses your perspective. Over time, dependence on God builds a quiet confidence within you. You become less shaken by external circumstances and more anchored in internal peace. Why? No longer panic when things don't go according to plan, because you have learned that God's plans are higher and more reliable than your own. Your emotional stability improves, your spiritual awareness deepens, and your faith becomes steady rather than reactive. There is also a powerful humility that develops when God is your only option. You recognize that your achievements, strength, and progress are not solely the result of your effort, but the result of God's grace. This humility keeps your heart soft, grateful, and teachable. It protects you from pride and keeps your relationship with God authentic and grounded. When you eventually come out of these seasons, you often realize that what felt like a crisis became a turning point. Your faith is stronger, your priorities are clearer, your trust is deeper, and your relationship with God is more intimate. You may not have chosen the struggle, but you would not trade the growth it produced. You emerge with a greater sense of purpose and spiritual maturity. These experiences also equip you to encourage others. When you meet people facing uncertainty, fear, or loss, you can speak with compassion and authenticity because you have walked that path yourself. Your testimony carries weight because it is rooted in lived experience rather than theory. You can remind others that God remains faithful even when everything else fails. Faith that grows when God is your only option is not shallow or fragile. It is resilient, grounded, and enduring. It does not depend on perfect conditions or constant success. It thrives even in uncertainty because it is anchored in a trustworthy God. This kind of faith transforms how you face every future challenge. You walk with greater confidence, humility, and peace, knowing that no matter what changes around you, God remains constant and dependable. In a world that constantly pushes urgency, noise, pressure, and performance, the idea of rest can feel almost irresponsible. Many people equate rest with laziness, weakness, or loss of productivity. They believe that if they slow down, everything will fall apart or opportunities will pass them by. Yet true rest is not the absence of effort, it is the presence of trust. Rest is a spiritual posture that declares confidence in God's control rather than fear-driven striving. When you choose rest in the middle of uncertainty, you activate a powerful weapon against anxiety, fear, and emotional exhaustion. Fear thrives in environments of constant tension and overthinking. The mind races with possibilities, regrets, and future worries. The body stays on edge, anticipating problems that may never happen. Over time, this internal stress drains joy, clarity, and spiritual sensitivity. Rest interrupts this cycle. It slows the heart, quiets the mind, and allows space for God's peace to settle. Rest does not deny reality. It reframes reality through trust. It reminds your soul that you are not the ultimate controller of outcomes. And God is actively working even when you pause. Choosing rest requires intentional faith. It means resisting the urge to panic when answers are not immediate. It means releasing the need to solve every problem instantly. It means trusting that God can accomplish more in your stillness than you can in your anxiety. This kind of rest is not passive. It is deeply active in the spirit. It involves surrendering worry, praying with expectation, and aligning your heart with God's promises rather than your fears. Rest also protects your emotional and spiritual health. When you live in constant pressure, your perspective becomes distorted. Small problems feel overwhelming, minor setbacks feel catastrophic, and relationships become strained. Rest restores balance. It allows you to see challenges more clearly and respond with wisdom instead of reaction. A rested heart hears God's guidance more accurately and discerns better decisions. Fatigue often clouds judgment, but peace sharpens discernment. There is a deep connection between rest and trust. If you truly believe God is in control, you can rest. If you believe everything depends on you, rest becomes difficult. Many people struggle to rest because they carry an unconscious belief that they must hold everything together. This belief creates chronic stress and internal pressure. Learning to rest means learning to release responsibility that does not belong to you. You are responsible for obedience and faithfulness, not for control. Eating every outcome. Rest is also an act of humility. It acknowledges human limitation and divine sovereignty. It says, I cannot do everything, but God can. This humility invites grace and strengthens dependence on God. When you rest, you give God room to work without interference from anxiety-driven decisions or rushed actions. Sometimes your best spiritual progress happens not when you are pushing harder, but when you are trusting deeper. Worship plays a key role in entering rest. When you worship, your focus shifts from your problems to God's presence. Worship calms the nervous system and reorients the heart toward gratitude and hope. It reminds you of God's faithfulness in the past and strengthens your confidence in his future provision. Even in difficult seasons, worship creates a peaceful atmosphere that protects your heart from despair. Rest also trains patience. In a culture that values instant results, waiting can feel uncomfortable. But waiting in peace strengthens endurance and maturity. It teaches you to remain steady rather than reactive. When you learn to wait without anxiety, you demonstrate deep trust in God's timing. Patience developed through rest produces emotional stability and spiritual strength. Fear often pressures people into unhealthy decisions. They rush into relationships, make impulsive financial choices, compromise values, or abandon long-term vision because they feel pressured by uncertainty. Rest creates space between emotion and action. It allows wisdom to guide decisions instead of fear. A rested mind evaluates options more clearly and aligns choices with long-term purpose rather than short-term relief. There is also physical restoration connected to rest. Chronic stress weakens the body, disrupts sleep, affects concentration, and lowers immunity. Rest restores energy, improves focus, and strengthens resilience. When you care for your body through healthy rhythms of rest, you honor the life God has entrusted to you and increase your capacity to serve effectively. Learning to rest is a process. Many people struggle at first because their minds are conditioned to constant activity. Stillness may feel uncomfortable or unproductive, but as you practice intentional rest, your nervous system adapts, your mind becomes calmer, and your heart becomes more peaceful. You begin to recognize the difference between productive effort and anxious striving. Rest also strengthens your faith because it trains you to trust God in unseen ways. When you stop obsessing over outcomes and start trusting God with them, you experience a deeper sense of peace and freedom. You become less controlled by circumstances and more anchored in God's presence. This inner stability allows you to face challenges with confidence rather than fear. Choosing rest does not mean avoiding responsibility or ignoring problems. It means approaching responsibilities from a place of peace rather than panic. It means handling challenges with wisdom rather than worry. It means trusting that God is capable of guiding, protecting, and providing even when you slow down, when rest becomes a lifestyle rather than an occasional break. Your entire perspective shifts. You become more patient with people, more compassionate with yourself, and more attentive to God's guidance. You develop emotional resilience and spiritual clarity. Fear loses its authority because peace has taken its place. Rest truly is a spiritual weapon. It silences anxiety, strengthens trust, restores energy, and protects your heart. When you learn to rest in God's control, you discover that peace becomes your strength and trust becomes your shield. Many people carry a hidden belief that God only helps those who have everything together, those who rarely fail, those who appear strong, disciplined, and spiritually flawless. This belief quietly produces guilt, shame, and insecurity. When mistakes happen or weaknesses surface, people often withdraw from God instead of running toward him. They feel unworthy of his help, undeserving of his favor, and disqualified from his promises. Yet the truth is far more freeing and powerful. God does not fight for the perfect. He fights for the surrendered. His strength flows not through human perfection, but through humble dependence and open hearts. Perfection creates pressure. It convinces people that they must perform spiritually, emotionally, and morally to earn God's involvement. This pressure leads to fear of failure, fear of exposure, and fear of rejection. People hide their struggles, mask their doubts, and suppress their weaknesses in an attempt to appear strong. Over time, this creates emotional isolation and spiritual distance. Instead of experiencing intimacy with God, they experience performance-driven religion. But God never designed a relationship with him to be built on performance. He desires honesty, humility, and trust. Surrender begins with acknowledging weakness rather than hiding it. It means admitting limitations, confessing struggles, and inviting God into areas where you feel inadequate or broken. This vulnerability is not weakness in God's eyes. It is courage. It takes courage to admit that you cannot fix everything on your own. It takes courage to trust God with your flaws, fears, and failures. When you surrender honestly, you create space for God's grace to operate freely in your life. God's power often becomes most visible in moments of weakness. When human strength runs out, divine strength takes over. This does not mean God causes weakness, but he uses it to redirect your dependence from self to him. When you stop relying on your own ability, intelligence, or discipline, you become more aware of God's guidance and presence. Your faith becomes relational rather than performance-based. You begin to trust God not because you feel strong, but because he is faithful. Surrender also dismantles pride. Pride convinces people they must appear capable and independent at all times. It resists asking for help and avoids vulnerability. Yet pride creates distance between the heart and God. Humility, on the other hand, attracts grace. And you acknowledge your need for God. You align yourself with his flow of strength and wisdom. God is not impressed by human perfection. He is drawn to surrendered hearts. Many people fear that if they reveal their weakness, they will be judged, rejected, or abandoned. But God responds differently than humans. He does not shame brokenness, he heals it. He does not condemn weakness, he strengthens it. He does not withdraw from failure, he restores from it. When you approach God honestly, you discover that his mercy is greater than your mistakes and his patience is deeper than your struggles. Surrender also releases freedom from comparison. When perfection becomes the goal, people constantly measure themselves against others. This creates insecurity, jealousy, and discouragement. But when surrender becomes the focus, your attention shifts from external standards to internal alignment with God. You stop striving to impress people and start seeking to please God. This shift brings peace, clarity, and emotional stability. God's involvement in your battles is not dependent on how strong you feel, how consistent you have been, or how flawless your record appears. It is dependent on your willingness to trust him and yield control. A surrendered heart invites divine intervention because it allows God to lead rather than resist. When you let go of self-sufficiency, you become more sensitive to God's direction and timing. Weakness also develops compassion. When you recognize your and need for grace, you become more patient and understanding toward others. You stop judging harshly and start extending kindness. This transformation reflects God's heart and deepens your relational maturity. God often uses personal struggles to shape empathy and humility that strengthen community and leadership. Surrender does not mean accepting defeat or passivity. It means trusting God's strength over your own. It means choosing obedience even when you feel inadequate. It means moving forward with faith rather than hiding behind fear. Surrender allows you to participate in God's work without carrying the pressure of perfection. There is also healing that comes through surrender. Emotional wounds, past failures, and internal shame often lose their grip when you allow God into those vulnerable spaces. Healing is not always instant, but it is progressive. As you continue to surrender daily, your confidence grows, your peace stabilizes, and your identity becomes anchored in God's love rather than in performance. Over time, you begin to realize that your imperfections do not disqualify you from God's purpose. They qualify you for deeper dependence on Him. Your story becomes a testimony of grace rather than self-achievement. You recognize that every victory in your life is ultimately the result of God's faithfulness, not your own perfection. When God fights for the surrendered, fear loses its authority. You no longer fear failure because you trust God's redemption. You no longer fear weakness because you trust God's strength. You no longer fear exposure because you trust God's grace. This freedom allows you to live authentically, courageously, and peacefully. A surrendered life experiences deeper intimacy with God, greater emotional health, stronger faith, and lasting peace. It releases the burden of perfection and replaces it with the joy of trust. When you stop trying to prove yourself and start trusting God, you discover that His power works most beautifully through humble, open, and surrendered hearts. There is a deep confidence that begins to grow within you when you truly understand that victory is already secured in God's hands. Many people live as if they are constantly fighting to earn peace, fighting to deserve favor, fighting to prove worth, and fighting to survive each new challenge. This mindset creates pressure, fear, and emotional exhaustion because the heart feels responsible for producing outcomes that only God can control. But when you realize that God has never lost a battle and never will, your perspective shifts from striving for victory to standing in victory. You begin to move through life with assurance rather than anxiety. Victory secured does not mean that life becomes free of challenges. It means that challenges no longer define your destiny or determine your identity. Storms may still come, delays may still happen, and opposition may still arise, but none of these have the final word over your life. God's authority is greater than any obstacle you face. His wisdom exceeds every uncertainty. His power surpasses every limitation. When you internalize this truth, fear loses its grip and faith becomes your foundation. Many people measure victory only by visible outcomes, success, comfort, recognition, or quick solutions, but God's definition of victory goes deeper. Sometimes victory looks like peace in the middle of chaos. Sometimes it looks like patience during delay. Sometimes it looks like forgiveness instead of bitterness. Sometimes it looks like obedience when compromise would be easier. These internal victories are evidence that God is actively shaping your character and strengthening your faith. They prepare you to handle external success with humility and wisdom. Standing in victory requires trusting God's promises even when circumstances appear uncertain. It means believing that God's plans are good even when the path feels confusing. It means trusting that delays serve a purpose even when you cannot yet see the outcome. Faith does not deny reality. It places reality under God's authority. When you choose to trust God's promises rather than your fears, your heart becomes anchored in hope rather than shaken by uncertainty. This assurance also transforms how you respond to setbacks. Instead of viewing obstacles as proof of failure, you begin to see them as temporary challenges within a larger story of God's faithfulness. You stop allowing discouragement to dominate your mindset. You learn to recover more quickly from disappointment because your confidence is rooted in God's unchanging character rather than in temporary circumstances. Understanding that victory is secured also strengthens patience. You no longer rush to force solutions or manipulate outcomes because you trust God's timing. You recognize that rushing ahead can create unnecessary complications, while waiting allows God to align every detail perfectly. Patience becomes easier when you know the outcome is already safe in God's hands. This perspective also produces gratitude. Instead of focusing on what is missing or delayed, you begin to recognize the blessings already present in your life. Gratitude shifts your attention from lack to abundance, from fear to faith, from pressure to peace. A grateful heart remains open, hopeful, and spiritually healthy. Standing in victory also builds emotional resilience. You become less reactive to criticism, less shaken by uncertainty, and less controlled by external validation. Your identity becomes anchored in God's love rather than in performance or approval. This stability allows you to navigate challenges with wisdom and calm rather than impulsive emotion. When you live with the assurance that God holds your future, you are more willing to take steps of faith. Fear often prevents people from pursuing their calling, forming healthy relationships, or stepping into new opportunities. But confidence in God's faithfulness empowers courage. You become more willing to obey even when the outcome is not guaranteed, because you trust God to guide and protect you along the way. This understanding also deepens your relationship with God. Instead of approaching Him only in moments of crisis, you develop a consistent connection rooted in trust and gratitude. Prayer becomes less about panic and more about partnership. Worship becomes less about desperation and more about appreciation. Your spiritual life becomes steady rather than reactive. Recognizing that victory is secured also protects your peace during waiting seasons. You no longer interpret delay as abandonment or failure. You trust that God is preparing something meaningful even when progress seems slow. This peace strengthens your endurance and keeps your heart hopeful during uncertainty. There is also freedom in knowing that you are not responsible for controlling every outcome. This releases pressure and prevents burnout. You can work diligently, love sincerely, and serve faithfully without carrying the burden of results. You trust God to complete what He begins. Standing in victory does not mean ignoring responsibility or avoiding challenges. It means facing them with confidence rather than fear. It means making wise decisions while trusting God with the outcome. It means maintaining faith even when circumstances fluctuate. Over time, this perspective transforms your entire lifestyle. You become more patient, more hopeful, more peaceful, and more courageous. You stop living in survival mode and start living in purpose. You stop reacting to every storm and start resting in God's stability. When you truly believe that victory is already secured in God's hands, your heart finds rest, your mind finds clarity, and your spirit finds strength. You move forward with confidence, knowing that no matter what challenges arise, God remains faithful, powerful, and fully in control.